Hey, welcome back to another episode of Genuine Questions. I hadn't really planned to do this topic, but I was inspired by a comment that was left on the last video that I made about my conversation with a liberal regarding student loan forgiveness. That person left a comment and said that I lost them when I started talking about Hitler because clearly my understanding of that time in history is skewed, to say the least. And I don't fault people who question anything that happened in history, like what the official narrative is that we're told, because there are so many things that I do know about that they've lied to us. So why would I assume that there's just this one topic that you're not allowed to ask any questions on and they've told us the entire truth about everything? I don't think anybody's a bad person for questioning anything. But in the context of that particular conversation I was showing in the last video about student loans, I was just trying to convince somebody that Joe Biden's responsible for pretty much all of the problems that they see in society, and maybe continuing to vote for him and the Democratic Party is not the best way to solve those problems. And I just think I had a specific goal in mind for that conversation, and it's hard to get somewhere with somebody if you jump off track and try to convince them that their entire understanding of history is wrong. So I'm just trying to meet people on their level for the purposes of those conversations. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds when talking to them about it. But it is my understanding of history, and I talked about it in a previous video on the channel. It's been a while since I've played that one, and I have a lot of new viewers now, so I'll just do a quick recap that there were a lot of American industrialists and capitalists and businessmen like the Rockefeller and the Rockefellers, I can't remember all of them, Colgate, a lot, AT&T was one of them, just a lot of predominant American companies that were helping fund the Nazi war effort. And the British royal family, like pretty much everybody that we look to as like the good guys, the allies, they were all secretly helping fund the Nazi war effort. All of those people were helping fund Hitler and prop him up basically until the end of the war effort, and then all of those people didn't have to answer for their involvement, and they just get painted as the heroes, and they go and they form the CIA and the American intelligence agencies, and they are, from that point in history, the bad guys. Killed JFK, were doing the cocaine smuggling with the Iran-Contra scandal, and then pumping it into South Central LA and creating the crack epidemic, 9/11, and now the Russiagate, Trump and the Russiagate stuff, and now COVID. Every weapons of mass destruction was in there along the way too. The CIA just lies about everything. So I am assuming that, and correct me if I'm wrong, this could be a wild assumption, but the way that I took the comment that was left on my last video about how that I lost them when I started talking about Hitler because I clearly didn't understand that point in history very well, I'm thinking that that might be a Holocaust denial type situation. Like I said, I don't question or fault anybody for questioning any official narrative that we've been told. I've seen a little bit about the Holocaust denial stuff online, and it's ranged from the entire thing's made up to the numbers are exaggerated. I haven't dug deep into that one myself to really know what the arguments are and why people think that. Personally, the reason for me is that ultimately it doesn't matter. The outcome's still the same. The CIA, the American intelligence agencies, the um, people that are running Great Britain, the royal family, all those people, they're still in charge. And whether they were funding Hitler and he did kill 6 million Jewish people and they all escaped culpability and now continue to rule the world and propagandize people, or if the story's made up or exaggerated, those are still the same people that have, for whatever their reasons, perpetuated this lie and taught the false narrative to the next generations. So either way, it seems that they are behind it. So I guess I hadn't really thought about it too much, but thinking about it since that comment was left, I've come to the conclusion that that's probably why I haven't taken a dive into that particular topic. And there was another video that was on this channel of, I can never pronounce the guy's name, if it's Dinesh or Dinesh, but he was talking about fascism, and he said that you don't you learn about who the founder of capitalism is. Karl Marx was the communist leader. You learn about socialism, but they don't really teach you about fascism that much, at least in the American public school. I know we didn't really touch on it, or they touched on it, but it was like you thought fascism was basically the same as a dictatorship. And Dinesh, I think is how you're supposed to pronounce it, he does a nice job of explaining how fascism is the merger of the government and corporations working together. So basically, it was my takeaway from it that it's a situation where the government doesn't have to violate your constitutional rights. That's the argument that liberals always say. Like, if you say someone's violating your freedom of speech, like, well, a private company can't violate your freedom of speech. That's something only the government can do. Technically correct, but what do you call that situation then where the private corporations and the government are partnered with each other, and basically the private corporations can do that dirty work for the government in exchange for tax breaks or whatever type of trade-off you can imagine that would occur in that situation. So when you have that type of system, that is where you're getting into fascism. It doesn't have to just be one dictator in charge of everything. You could also have it set up where you have like a shadow government or a deep state, and then you just have two political parties and everybody votes for one or the other, and that way they have the illusion of choice. But they don't care who you vote for because they've bought the candidate on both sides. So it doesn't matter if you pick Barack Obama or Mitt Romney. It doesn't matter if you pick Barack Obama or John McCain. When push comes to shove, these people are all on the same side. So that would be a way to have a fascist system in place, but there's really nobody to revolt against it. So I think it's a 1984 quote, but about how people can't rebel if they don't know that they're oppressed. I'm butchering the quote horribly, but that's the gist of it, is that you can't fight the system if you don't know that you're in it. And what a great way to do that. If you want to have that illusion of choice, you just have the political puppet show for everybody to blindly go along thinking, oh, well, we're still in a democracy because I have a choice. So now I just want to show a couple clips from Jordan Peterson, because I think this is the larger point, at least that I am concerned about, is I do think that something like the Holocaust could happen. I don't know if it did. I don't know if it did the way that they said that they did, but I do understand through human nature how it could. I've seen it now with my own eyes with the COVID pandemic, where everybody within just like a couple weeks was ratting out people for not wearing a mask or not social distancing. I had one lady tell me that she just would hang out in the Home Depot parking lot on Saturdays and wait for employees to come outside and have their mask pulled down below their nose so she could call and report them to the health department. So there clearly is something inside of people that do relish that authority that they have over others, that sense of superiority. And especially now seeing it firsthand, that does make me think that people could be propagandized enough to go along with something like the Holocaust. And if you don't want to use the Holocaust as the example, there's plenty of other atrocities that have been committed throughout human history where it's been justified as, well, for the greater good, and being able to convince a wide swath of the population to go along with this because they think they're the good guys. And this first clip that I want to show you of Jordan Peterson is where he's explaining to his students about the pitfalls of victimhood. And that's something else that I have noticed myself in society, that you get a lot of social credit by being in one of the perceived victim classes. That does not typically jive with how I understand history, where it seems like the when there was slavery in the United States, even after that, if you want to go to like the civil rights movement, and we'll use the movie Remember the Titans as the example, is the vast majority of people felt that they were in the right by telling these black kids that we don't want them in our school. The quarterback's girlfriend dumps him because he's friends with the black kids now, and she feels very self-righteous that she's the good person doing this. Historically, while people are committing atrocities, they don't realize that they're doing it in real time. They are doing it because they think that this is what the good guys should be doing. And history does seem to repeat itself.
One of the things that Maya and I found when we were writing this paper, we were looking at the discourse that precedes genocide in genocidal states. And the enhancement of a sense of victimization on the part of one of the groups, usually the group that's going to commit the genocide. First of all, their sense of being victims is much heightened by the demagogues who are trying to stir up this sort of hatred. So they basically say, look, you've been oppressed in a variety of ways, and these are the people who did it, and they're not going to stop doing it, and this time we're going to get them before they get us. It's something like that. And so there's something very pathological about the enhancement of victimization, which is... But then the proper framework from within which to interpret that, I believe, is that that's characteristic of life. You can't take it personally in some sense. And you can't divide the world neatly into perpetrators and victims. And you certainly can't divide the world neatly into perpetrators and victims and then assume that you're only in the victim class and then assume that that gives you certain, like, access to certain forms of redress, let's say. It gets dangerous very rapidly if you do that sort of thing. So, for example, one of the things that characterized the Soviet Union, the Soviets were very much enamored of the idea of class guilt. So, for example, although it was only about 40 years previously that the serfs had been emancipated, they weren't much more than slaves, right? And so that was the bulk of the Russian population. They were bought and sold along with the land. So they had been emancipated, and some of them, many of them had turned into independent farmers, and some of them had become reasonably prosperous because, at least in principle, I presume a certain proportion of them from being crooked, but I presume a larger proportion from actually being able to raise food. And of course, at that time, the bulk of the Russian food population was produced by these relatively successful peasant farmers. And relatively successful would mean maybe they had a brick house or something, and maybe they had a couple of cows, and maybe they were able to hire a few people. And so, you know, it wasn't like they were massive landowners or anything. When the communists came in, they described those landholders as parasites, essentially. predicated on the Marxist idea that if someone had extracted profit from an enterprise, that they had basically stolen that profit from the people, say, that they had employed or otherwise oppressed. And so you could be a member of the Kulak, K-U-L-A-K, K-U-L-A-K, you could be a member of the Kulak class. And then because you were a member of that class, you were automatically guilty. And so what happened was, and you got to think this through to really understand what happened. So what happened was the intellectual communists were sent out in cadres out into these little towns to find people who would help them round up the kulaks. Now you got to think about what a small town is like, because so imagine you're in a town and there's 3 or 4 people or maybe 10 people or something like that who are a little more successful than everyone else. And a certain number of people are going to be fine with that and maybe even happy about it because they regard those people as particularly productive and, you know, as stalwart members of the community, regardless of their flaws. But there's going to be some people who are not happy about it at all, that are going to be very resentful about that and jealous. And so those are going to be people whose characters, I would say, are of the less positive type. The intellectuals came in and said, this is unfair that this happened to you. You've actually been victimized, and now it's your opportunity to go have your revenge. And so that's exactly what happened. Now, in some of the villages, sometimes the peasants would actually surround the farmsteads of these more successful people and try to defend them, but that never worked out for very long. And so then these mobs, these angry mobs, would go into the farmhouses and strip the place right down to nothing. And they packed these people up and sent them on trains with no food out to Siberia, where there was no place to live. And so that they were packed into houses, you know, maybe they had a square meter each to live in, and all their children died of typhoid, and many of them froze to death. Many people died. Millions of people died as a consequence of the dekulakization. Well, so that's a little story about how victimization, how the idea of victimization and perpetration can get out of hand extraordinarily rapidly. And so whenever people are beating the victim drum, you know, they'll cover that up with empathy, roughly speaking. We're speaking on behalf of the oppressed. It's like, maybe you are, but maybe you're no saint, because, you know, you're so sure that you're a saint and you're only speaking from the position of good. It's highly unlikely.
So I wanted to show that clip too, because I just thought it was ironic from the conversation that I had a couple of videos ago with the liberals, where they were trying to reclaim the word woke and said that it's just synonymous with empathy. It's just like Jordan Peterson said, where a lot of times the people who are acting like they are the champions of these perceived victims, they disguise, or to them they're not even disguising it, but just the way they justify it to themselves is they're the ones being empathetic, they're helping you, and a lot of times their help sucks in the long run. These next couple of clips are about how people don't see that in themselves. They're always assuming that they are the empathetic ones, they are the good guys, because they just assume that they are nice people, and they take that for granted, and they don't appreciate the atrocities that the human race is capable of committing. And everybody wants to picture themselves as being the person that hid the Jewish people under their floorboards, or had the house on the Underground Railroad to take in the slaves. But you have to appreciate the fact that that was not the vast majority of the population. In fact, that was a pretty small and brave minority of the population that was willing to go against the mob, the socially accepted laws and decorum of the time. And those people faced severe consequences if they got caught doing that. So it took a huge personal risk that not many people took. So statistically speaking, if you were living through one of these times in history, you are not going to be the good guys. You're gonna, in some fashion, be with the bad guys, whether you enjoy it, whether you're forced to do it, whether you stand by quietly and don't speak out. All of those groups of people, that's the majority of the population. It's very unlikely that you are brave enough to go against that kind of social pressure.
There was a lesson to learn from the Holocaust. We're always reminded that. Never forget. We've learned our lesson. There's a lesson to be learned. It's like, okay, fair enough, man. What was the lesson? That's the question. What was the lesson? And the lesson is, you're the Nazi. If you were there, that would have been you. You think, well, I'd be Oskar Schindler. I'd be rescuing the Jews. It's like, no, I'm afraid not.
Yeah,
You'd at least not be saying anything.
Right.
And you might also be actively participating. You might also enjoy it. To be good, truly good, you can't just follow rules. That's very clear in the Harry Potter story. And you also have to be able to understand malevolence. And in order to understand malevolence so that you can withstand it, you have to understand that part of you that's malevolent. Because if you don't, you're naive. And if you're naive, you're easy pickings. Part of personality development is to understand your shadow. And the shadow is those things about you that you do not want to admit to. And you can learn about your shadow by reading history. You know, you can read about Auschwitz. You can read about the concentration camps in Russia. And you can imagine yourself as a guard instead of as a heroic rescuer of unfortunate victims, which would be very, very unlikely. And once you can imagine yourself as a guard, which is a terrifying thing to do, then you understand something about yourself. You cannot have proper respect for yourself until you know that you're a monster, because you won't act carefully enough. You know, if you think, well, I'm a nice person, I'd never do anyone any harm, it's like, you're no saint. You can be sure of that. And the harm that you do people can come in many, many ways. And so, if you regard yourself as harmless, inoffensive, nice, well, why do you have any reason to be careful? You're like a teddy bear sitting on a shelf. Even if you throw it at someone, no one's going to get hurt.
Now I just want to show another clip from his speech, because the similarities between how, if you believe the official Holocaust story, if the similarities between that and what happened with the COVID-19 pandemic are scarily similar. And just instead of what Hitler did, which was convince the German population that Jewish people were dirty plague rats and a threat to public health, now the modern day version of that is just that unvaccinated people are dirty plague rats and a threat to public health. And therefore, it's okay to ostracize them from society, that you would support having some sort of vaccination passport to be able to go eat in restaurants or go to concerts or whatever types of restrictions these businesses want to put in place. And then that, you know, that's not a violation of your rights, because that's a private business checking your vaccination status, not the government, and HIPAA only applies to government. Just another way to get around that particular issue. But just because something is technically legal doesn't mean that it's not pretty effed up policy and thing to support. People with nefarious intentions are always going to try to find loopholes and way to skirt around the rules. So when you see their tactic, you see the move, you should call them out on it and shut that down, not say, meh, it's fine, because it's technically not illegal to do it. Truthfully, that is what I am afraid of in society now, that they have brainwashed the public into thinking that vaccinated people or unvaccinated people are horrible and selfish and spreading this disease, and oh, we should just round them up and ship them off to quarantine camps because they don't care about the greater good of society and they're a threat to everybody. And if that's what they're trying to do, I think there is a lot of public support for that, especially at my old job when I had to talk to way more people just in the general public. People that I barely knew were totally comfortable telling me that they think that unvaccinated people shouldn't receive hospital treatment because you made your choice, so you shouldn't be allowed to go use the healthcare system if something happens to you. But those same people wouldn't deny an overweight person diabetes medication even though they brought that upon themselves, or a smoker who gets cancer. Like, we still treat everybody regardless of their risky lifestyle choices. But people were way on board with denying jobs and healthcare and access to public spaces based on your vaccination status. A vaccine, by the way, that does not even stop you from getting or spreading COVID. So I believe I have to say, per the YouTube guidelines here, it does lessen your chances of getting the virus. It does lessen your chances of transmitting it, and it does lessen the severity of your symptoms if you get it. But if you catch it from a vaccinated or unvaccinated person, it doesn't really matter. It just protects you as the individual. It doesn't do anything to help the rest of society. So this entire argument about unvaccinated people being a threat to the public and public health is stupid.
So when Hitler came to power, he was very interested in public health campaigns. And so he formulated a number of policies, including formulating these vans that went around screening people for tuberculosis. At the same time, he announced a policy to beautify and purify Germany. And so he encouraged the factory owners to clean up the factories, to get rid of the rats and the insects, and to plant flowers and so forth in front, right? So it was cleanliness and beauty. They used Zyklon B as the agent for disinfecting the factories. Zyklon B was the gas that was used in the gas chambers. So Hitler started out by getting rid of the rats and the parasites and the insects in Germany, along with his public health campaign. And then he moved into the insane asylums and started a euthanasia campaign. And then he moved outside into the broader political sphere and started to target the people that he didn't consider pure as parasites, capitalizing on the behavioral immune system and people's intrinsic sense of disgust.
I think it was the guy from Fox, it's not Dan Bongino, but it's close. Dan Bongino. Dan Bongino. I think it was him that said something about how conservatives think that liberals are good people with bad ideas, but liberals think that conservatives are bad people with bad ideas, I guess. I don't know if that's the general sentiment, but that is certainly how I feel. I do truly think that a lot of the liberals, at least the ones that I know, really think that they are fighting the good fight, doing things for the greater good. They just do not understand that element of human nature and propaganda and history, that when that's the position that you find yourself in, that you're doing something for the greater good and you're supported by all the corporations, which incidentally are the people that liberals are supposed to hate. They're supposed to want to eat the rich and hate capitalism. But all of these mega corporations are on their side with every major issue. And you're on the side of the government, you're on the side of the media, so you're not part of the resistance. You are part of the machine. And I don't think that they realize that, but as I said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and what a better way, if you are an evil person, to commit atrocities is to get the public to go along with it and convince them that they're on the side of righteousness. So you have to be it's not easy to think about all of this stuff, but like they say, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Things aren't always going to be easy for you. Usually taking the easy way out is not a good thing. I remember being taught when I was growing up that when you're standing up for what's right, when you're standing up for the truth, a lot of times you're going to have to be standing alone. but you should stand up for what you believe in spite of the fact that that's going to be a consequence, that the vast majority of people in the mob is going to turn against you. They're not going to want to be your friend anymore. But it's a short-term pain and loneliness, but ultimately you're better for it that you stood up for what was right and what you believed in. And a lot of people have seemed to forgotten those lessons and then just think that the right thing is just always the thing that comes easy, that I can just agree with everybody around me all the time and just say that I just want to be nice and inclusive and help people. And you're not, that's a very easy thing to believe.
So it's one step at a time. And that's the thing, is that you end up in very bad places one step at a time. So you've got to watch those steps. And if you do things wrong, the consequences of doing them wrong can be truly catastrophic. You know, one of the things I learned from reading Viktor Frankl first, but then Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who I think did a deeper job, and Václav Havel thought the same thing. These people were very much trying to understand what happened in places like Nazi Germany and in the Soviet Union. Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago is a particularly good analysis of what happened in the Soviet Union. And his conclusion, and it's a 2,100-page conclusion, and it's like hammered home with a hammer. It's a book that everyone should read. First of all, what he does is document just how terrible things were in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959. And no matter how terrible you think they were, unless you know the stories, they were a lot more terrible than that. And they were terrible personally, because everyone lied. They were terrible in families, because 2 out of 5 people were government informers. They were terrible among friends because no one could tell each other the truth. They were terrible socially because the whole system was corrupt and ran on slave labor. And they were terrible philosophically because the doctrine of man upon which the state was founded was hopeless and nihilistic. And they were murderous, destructive, and genocidal. They got it wrong at every single level of analysis simultaneously. And the question is, why? And Solzhenitsyn's answer, and to some degree Viktor Frankl's answer as well, and Václav Havel, and I would say also Nelson Mandela and Gandhi, they all ended up in the same conceptual sphere. And the answer was because individual people lived crooked lives. Because individual people swallowed lies and spoke them and didn't stand up for the truth. And the corruption that spread from each individual pulled the entire state mechanism into that corruption and made everything into hell. You know, there are other theories. Obedience, right? That's kind of the Milgram idea. It's easy to make human beings obedient to people in authority. And I've explored that idea quite a bit with regards to what happened, for example, in the Nazi concentration camps. And yes, you can set circumstances up so that people are likely to be obedient to orders that are pathological. There's no doubt about that. And yes, sometimes that's indicative of the weakness of their character, but that's not the issue. And the idea that what happened in Nazi Germany was because a population of good people listened to a tiny minority of bad people, that's really not a good theory. The Nazi ethos was there at every single level of the social organization, right from the familial all the way up to the leadership. It was the same thing all the way up and all the way down, and the same thing in the Soviet Union. And I just cannot see how, after the 20th century, anybody with any sense could possibly not see that as true.
So then that goes back to what I was talking about in that last video about student loans and how you don't want to give the government control over every single aspect of our lives like that, from education to healthcare to basically everything that the liberals want the government to handle for them. Like, you give them this immense amount of power, it bleeds into every aspect of your life, and that is the type of propaganda that influences people to commit atrocities. They want to think it's these conspiracy theories on the internet and people that don't trust Bill Gates or Dr. Fauci and people that voted for Donald Trump and people who are unvaccinated and QAnons, and they want to think that all of this propaganda is so dangerous to the very fabric of democracy. And all of that takes place on 4chan. And historically, that is just not how it happens. You convince people to do that when everything that makes up the core functions of society, that when they control the media and they control healthcare and education and the government and private corporations, so they can skirt around the Constitution that way, when they control everything like that, that is the propaganda that you need to be on guard for. I'm not saying that there aren't conspiracy theories on the internet, but I think a lot of the things that are labeled as conspiracy theories is actually the truth. And I do think the conspiracy theories that are out there do not actually cause harm to society in the way that these liberals like to cry and screech and complain that they do. I find their conspiracy theories that are pushed all over the mainstream news, like Donald Trump works for Vladimir Putin, and Joe Biden's going to tear down the system that he built up over the last 60 years. I think those conspiracy theories are far more dangerous and destructive to the fabric of democracy. I do want to show these couple of clips from the documentary The Plot Against the President. I thought it was a very good documentary about how Russiagate happened and how the FBI used the media and framed Michael Flynn, and then basically the Hillary Clinton campaign was funding all of the Russian P-tape allegations about Trump. But there were a lot of good sound bites in that, and I just want to play this one for you that I think is relevant to what we're talking about now.
The most powerful organs of the state are not merely corrupt, but that they've been weaponized to go after perceived domestic enemies. And that's very scary and bad. It means we don't live in the United States of America as any of us would like to understand it. I don't live in that country anymore. And the realization of that is maybe the saddest thing I've ever gone through in my life.
It's not just that we're not the United States anymore, it's what is your humanity? What kind of a human being are you if you are essentially a slave? If you are run by intelligence services, if you're run by the press, if these are the people who dominate your public sphere, if these are the people who make decisions about how you live, about how your family lives, about how your friends live, these are the things that you have to contest all the time if you wish to stay a free person and a free people.
Why is moral courage among members of Congress, why is that rare? Well, it's rare in Congress because it's rare in the world. It's a rare trait to go against the mob. Aristotle had called moral courage the chief of all virtues, because if you don't have courage, then you can't be honorable, because sometimes to be honorable and honest, you have to speak out against lies. You have to stand up for the truth.
I think about this way more than I probably should, but I just do not understand who the liberals see as their heroes. If you go through any of the historical events that we just talked about, that their behavior now and the way they are going along with the establishment and trying to ostracize people from society that don't agree with them, historically, you're the bad guys. But even if you look to fiction, for examples, like I grew up in the 90s, I like the Harry Potter series, but in that book series, it's like the entire fifth book is Harry is hated by the entire wizarding world. They used to love him, but then the bad guys get in control of the government and the media, and they start printing all these stories about him to make him seem like a crazy conspiracy theorist. And him and all of his supporters, people who believe in the truth and aren't just going along with the news, they have to go underground and do secret radio shows. They're the ones being hunted and oppressed and persecuted. And even in that series, it shows how really good-hearted people who know you very well can still put this propaganda on a greater weight or higher pedestal than the actual lived experiences with the person that they know, because there was a part in the series where the news wrote a nasty article about Hermione. I don't remember all the details. It has been a while since I've read through it. But Ron's mom, who knows Hermione, she stayed at her house. It's one of her kids' best friends. So they have a personal relationship where she only knows this girl to be a good, smart, kind-hearted kid. She takes what she read in the paper and starts like being a turd to her kid's friend, because she discounts all of her own lived experience and just gets blinded by propaganda. So I don't see how they don't see that similarity and that parallel. And to me, that was one of the lessons, the takeaways from it, is that you shouldn't just go along with the crowd and the mainstream news, and you should really support the truth tellers, support the underdogs, support the people that are truly being silenced by the establishment, not just the people that the establishment is telling you as the victims. Because go back to that first Jordan Peterson clip, those are typically the people that then rise up and commit a genocide once they have been brainwashed into believing that they're the victims, being told that they're the victims. But truthfully, at least from what I am seeing going on in the present day, it is the tactics that they use against the oppressed. They are being used against people who question the government and who aren't willing to comply with their mandates and their orders. So you just get painted with the brush of QAnon, unvaxxed, crazy conspiracy theorist. Nobody listen to that person, and definitely don't let them eat in restaurants anymore. Handmaid's Tale is another example that I can think of too, when the flashback episodes where they show you how this oppressive regime was able to overtake society, they cut off the bank accounts to women. And again, if you want to look at who that's happening to in modern day society, they are trying to fine people through their bank accounts for spreading misinformation about COVID and the election. So it's these people that question the government narrative, that aren't willing to comply, that they are demonizing and ostracizing and turning public opinion against. So even in the liberal dystopian universe of Gilead, it's still the tactics they use to implement that dystopian society are being used today, just not against the people they're telling you they're being used against. If you open your eyes and pay attention to what's happening, it's happening to the people who are speaking out and questioning the government. So how you don't see the behavioral patterns, the tactics, and you just continue to fall for this narrative about certain people being oppressed, when those are the people that all the corporations, all the government, all the celebrities, everybody's championing and supporting. It's not, they're always going to have like a scapegoat or a victim, and usually whoever the scapegoat is actually the target of the genocidal tactics. Even movies like V for Vendetta and Hunger Games, it's the government who's controlling the media. It's the government who's the bad guys, and you're rooting for these underdogs, these rebels who are fighting for freedom and standing up to the establishment, and you cheer them on when you're watching these movies, and everybody wants to be like Katniss from the Hunger Games. But then when you go live your life, you just side with the media and the government basically every chance that you get. So I don't understand who they think they are emulating. I mean, even if I am wrong and I am the one that is being blinded by all this propaganda and going along with the bad guys. At least I've have some historical references and some things that have helped me make my decision that I feel like I'm supporting the good guys in this battle going on right now. So if anybody has an answer to that, that is a genuine question that I'm asking. I just want to know, like, who do they see themselves as? Even if you go back to, I remember reading a book about Jackie Robinson in school, and it was mentioned in there that there were a handful of white baseball players who were nice to Jackie Robinson, who wouldn't slide into him and try to, like, cleat him in the shin. And those players who were nice to him, they got spit on by the fans as well. They got booed. People did not like them. And that, it goes back to when you have to stand up for what's right, that is often lonely, but you have to just trust that you are doing the right thing, and hopefully other people will come around. And if they don't, they're probably not the type of people that you want around to begin with. They take the path of least resistance, and they just go along with whatever's easy and convenient for them. And honestly, I would think that most of them probably didn't even think about this stuff that much, and I could accept that if you're just not into history or politics or whatever you want to call it, and you just like to, whatever your other hobbies are, you focus on those and you don't think that much about it. That's fine. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. The people that annoy me are the ones who screech and cry about this stuff and go get naked and poop on top of a cop car because feminism or whatever. But then those people spend literally no time looking into anything before they form their opinion. And they're so self-righteous, and it really annoys me. So they don't seem to think any deeper than what the news media tells them to think. They give them the parameters that they're allowed to consider a story in, and if you go outside those parameters and you start to ask any other questions, well, now you're a conspiracy theorist and probably a really bad person too, and probably shouldn't be allowed to go to concerts anymore. So it's just crazy to me to watch it play out in real time and see how relatively easy it was to get people to go along with this stuff and be authoritarian like that, while ironically pretending like they are Antifa. Like I said, it's weird to get to watch it as it plays out, but I hope that as more people start to wake up and realize that there's something that can be done to stop it before it's too late. But fortunately, I don't have a high level of confidence in that right now. That's all that I have for this video, and I promise the next one is going to be about the World Economic Foundation and Bill Gates, and goes along with this topic too, to talk about what I think that their potential motives might be behind all of this sketchy COVID narrative and vaccine rollout. And I've broken down a few possible motives that I've considered, and I'm almost ready to go through all of those clips with you guys and talk about which ones I think are the most likely. So none of them are great, but I think some may be more likely than others. But want to consider all of the possibilities.